Welcome to Philosophy in the City. This is the second week in the second lecture. I'm a little behind in lectures, so I'll have the last lecture up, which will be a slightly longer one, talking about the city as a growth machine later this week, probably Thursday or Friday. Well, definitely by Friday. What we're going to do here quickly is look at the different theories of how the behaviors of individuals are determined. So there are two main views about how, given some individual and given some environment, what features of the environment or the individual will determine what that individual will do. And the different theories locate the source of that behavior either in the individual themselves, their features, or in the environment themselves. So in the character-centered view, which is more of an old-fashioned view, people are thought, or behaviors are thought to be mostly determined by features of the individual. So you take some individual and you put them in many different types of situations, they'll behave in similar ways. Of course, this is, it's a qualified thing. It's not as if, you take a person, you put them in a situation with a bridge over a lava pit or something, and you put them in a situation with no bridge over a lava pit, they're going to do the same thing. That's not what it's saying. Rather, it's saying that, given some family of different environments that are sort of similar in certain ways, they provide to the individuals similar sort of options. The choice that the individual makes is either determined, for the character-centered view by the features of the individual, or in the environmental-centered view, the environment-centered view, in those features of the environment. So, starting with the character-centered view, there's two different types that we'll look at today. There's the innateness view, which basically says that, the sort of features we're looking at are innate features. They're going to be features of the individual that are not learned. So they arise from the individual from birth or something like that. And so we'll mostly be looking at genetic sort of features. Or they're learned features, meaning that they do not exist within the individual at birth, but that they arise later. So we're going to be taking the learned view most seriously, because the innateness view seems problematic, because it seems like people do learn quite a bit and this determines what they do. But the learned view seems plausible in certain ways. So we'll look at that a little bit. Then there's the environment-centered view, which says that behaviors are mostly determined by the environment. And the important feature of this is that given some environment, different sorts of people will behave in a similar way. So we might worry that this takes some of the guilt of certain actions, or some of the responsibility of certain actions away from the individual, because it basically says that no matter what the individual is like, whether they're a good person or a bad person, whatever that means, they will act in a certain way. And so these sort of behaviorist views, that say that the environment really determines the behavior, are problematic in that way, but we'll have to look at that. Because this is the sort of view that guides much of city development theory, right? So the view that changing an urban design, changing the way that the urban landscape, the features of the urban landscape, determines behavior in some serious way, is what gives urban design its relevance for us. So it's likely that there's some mixed view that we should have. So that's the third type. There's some mixture between the character-centered view and the environmental-centered view. And so we'll talk about this a little bit, but we can just imagine that, of course it's plausible that, certain cultural, certain learned features of the individual has an effect on how they behave, but still there are major features of the environment that in some sort of significant way determine the behavior of an individual. So we'll have to take that seriously. So I'll start with the character-centered theories. But first, let us think about the question we're actually answering. So what are we trying to figure out here? What are these theories about? Well, what we're trying to explain is this, feature that we've noticed and Milgram noticed, that people living in certain environments have different behaviors. They behave in different ways in similar situations. So in, a helping situation where someone seems to need help, it seems like people in cities act in a more callous fashion than people in a small town. So we want to explain this, and the first way we could do this is to say there's something different in character about people who live in cities. And there's two different ways we can look at this. The first is to say that, okay, what is this feature? Where does it come from? Well, it's innate to those people. So there's a different sort of people who live in cities, city people, and they are more callous, right? They have some sort of feature, not sure what it is, right, that makes them more callous. So we would probably have to give some sort of genetic story about this. We'd have to say that there's something genetically different about people who live in cities. This is, as you saw in the Brouwer chapter that you read, this is a sort of old-fashioned view, right? There's some theories that people actually were different in some sort of innate way who lived in cities. And, we can sort of think about how we might explain this in this sort of modern way. I'm not assuming that this is a good explanation, but you might think that there's some sort of catalyst event. So there's some feature of cities that draw people with callous features, right? Or, some the features we're interested in. Let's take callousness. It draws them to cities, and then once they're there, they tend to have children who are also callous, because genetics do determine a good deal of what a person will be like. And thus, given this, some way of getting these people originally in the city, and given what genetics do, we end up with a city full of callous people. So you might think think of some plausible stories here, perhaps. You could say, well, people who are especially driven might go to cities and they might be callous. People who, I don't know, like excitement might be especially callous and they go to cities. But this might be a stretch. So any sort of story you can give about how people ended up in the city originally is, at least I think it seems, somewhat far-fetched and not very plausible. So let's set this one aside. Not many people will say that there's something innate about city people that makes them different from town people, and so we might have to look somewhere else. I think people are right to be suspicious of this view. So let's look at the learned view. So this is an adaptation view. And it says that, once people get to cities, they're faced with certain situations, faced with, features of the environment, and they need to adapt to these. Well, how do they adapt to these? Well, they learn. They change their mind in various ways, such that now they behave in ways that are more conducive to living in the city. Okay, this is fine for when you're living in the city, right? As Milgram says, you have to develop certain strategies for dealing with all this information. If you take his view to be true. So that seems right. The key point to the learned view is that even when you leave the city, you still have certain learned tendencies. So even when you no longer have all this information barraging you, you no longer are in a situation where helping is ambiguous, right? When you're really unsure whether the person you're trying to help is actually trying to scam you or something. Because the crime rate maybe in your new town is very low, and you might have no reason to be suspicious, like you may have had in the city. So even in this new situation, you will still display this, similar behaviors, maybe not the same ones, but similar behaviors, and so it has this carryover effect. So this is important. So this separates the learned view from the simple environmental view, because given some person, they're in some situation, they learn how to they adapt to that by learning, and then even if you move them to a new situation, they will still act in the same way. So you might think that the learned view is plausible, but it seems like even in some situation where you have a person who has learned certain adaptations to some environment, say a town, and you move them into a city, very quickly they sort of morph their behaviors to account for the new pressures of the city. Well, what is now conducive to interacting with the city. And so this is not going to happen right away. As Milgram points out, the tourist certainly looks at the city very differently from the local. But it seems like, even though you can say the person is certainly learning how to act in the environment, you might just think of this as some rational process of assessing the environment itself and then acting. So acting according to the environment. And you might not need this sort of weighty learning, right? You might not need this sort of cognitive learning which has a carryover effect. And so you could have a view that people are just acting in different environments and they're acting rationally. So, essentially people face situations and their actions are guided by rules of rationality. So it is difficult to know what exactly rationality is, but often people in these situations say, you can strip it down to some sort of bare bones, maximizing your preferences, right? So you're trying to get what you want. And if you are simply trying to get what you want, what you want might be world peace or helping other people, but it's still what you want, right? Or it might be making lots of money. So if we just define rationality as trying to get what you want, this is sort of a simple way of thinking about it, it seems like if people are actually interacting with the environment and changing their behaviors to the environment such that they're acting rationally, it seems like they're rational. And so we can't say, even when things turn out badly, right? And we'll sort of, talk on the next slide about this a little bit, about what this might be. But for instance, in Milgram's case, say there's really someone who needs help, and all these people in the city just walk past them. This seems like something wrong or stupid, you might think. And certainly those people do care about helping people if they are actually in need of help. And so you might think, even though that seems like the wrong thing to do in that situation, it's still rational, right? Even though the outcome was bad, it's still rational. And so this might be problematic, you might think. You might think that, well, even though it seems like they're acting rationally, that they're maximizing their preferences or whatever, they're still acting poorly or wrongly or something. So we'll look pretty closely at this sort of view, the environment-centered view, because most of what urban theory, urban design theory especially, is about is trying to change behaviors based upon changing the environment. So it's hard to make people learn things. It's hard, it's certainly hard to change what's innate for people, but you can change the environment. And so there's an assumption that something like environment-centered, the environment-centered theory is right? That if we change the environment, it'll change certain behaviors. But of course, we'll also have to hang on to the learned view, and this might be culturally learned. So people might learn, through cultural practices what sort of things they should do. And they also learn by experience. So people aren't, acting completely rationally given the situation. They're using certain, schemata thinking schemata about what what they should do. They're not thinking through the situation in some sort, like computers or something. They're using certain tools that they have learned and applying them to situations. And so we need to keep that in mind when we focus on the environment-centered view, that this, the sort of mechanism by which this will occur is still learned, and it's still cognitive. So we're not these perfectly rational beings. So Milgram presents, a fascinating theory of why people act the way they do in cities. So basically, what Milgram thinks is that people would be overloaded by the amount of stuff going on, perceptual, cognitive, and, taxing your time in cities. And so if people didn't have some sort of strategy for dealing with all the things going on in cities, they would just be unable to do anything. Right? They just would be unable to act in the best way, for what they want to do. And this does not exist in towns. And so because there is this overload, possibility of overload at least, in cities, and not in smaller towns, you get this differential between how people act. And so, there's three types of, three main types of possible overload. There's perceptual overload, and you can experience this if you go to Times Square. It's actually dizzying there, right? There's just too much going on in Times Square in New York. Too many lights flashing, too many people around, too many signs and things just vying for your attention. And if you didn't filter it, you would sit there bewildered, I think, for a long time, unable to act, unable to sort of figure out what's going on. And so Milgram thinks that, in these cases, you selectively filter out. You ignore the signs. You ignore the, certain people. You rank things according to importance to you. And in a similar way, in cognitive overload, when, even if you perceived everything, you'd still have to process all this information, what it means to you, what you should do with it. So, in that case, you need to figure out, what am I doing now, and what sort of things are relevant for that. And if they're not relevant, then even if you perceive them, you won't continue processing, and you won't sort of figure out how you might do something with them. You just ignore them. And in a similar way, you could be overloaded for demands on your time, right? So if you went around a major city trying to help everyone who was asking for it, you would probably spend most of your days helping those people. And so Milgram thinks, one thing we do is we have to act more callous, because if we didn't, we would just have no time to do anything else. And in fact, what we might do is just set up an institution to take care of this for us, right? So we hire social workers to go out and help these people, and then we think that, well, we've solved it, right? So we don't need to deal with that anymore. We've lived up to any moral obligations we might have, and so we can set that aside and not be bothered by them. So, you might think, possibly rightly, that this is not what we should do, but it seems like, according to Milgram, and I think he might be right about this, this might be what we actually do. So this, this filtering, just to make this point again, is really important to how urban residents behave. And if we can alter how people are able to process information, what sort of strategies they need to bring to bear to a certain situation, we can change their behavior possibly. Because their behavior is a result of adaptations they need, in the immediate time, to the information they're experiencing and their needs to process it. Now there's a second type of environmental explanation that we can talk about, and this is going to be different from the view that we're being overloaded by perceptual and cognitive information, and that's that it's not the information that's the issue. It's the fact that we're in certain choice situations that dictate that we do something that you wouldn't think would be good, even though it's rational. So there's a separation of what we might think is the long-term good thing to do and what's actually rational for us to do. And so it seems like we can model behavior in cities after what's called a repeated prisoner's dilemma game. So this is from game theory. You might have experience from game theory, and if that's the case, this will just be a repetition of that. If you don't, then this might be quite informative. So before I go into this specific game, so the prisoner's dilemma, and I'll describe the story of where the name comes from in a second, I'll give a short primer on how game theory works. So what are games? So all games are interactions between different individuals, called players, and the payouts of these games, so what each player gets out of the interaction, is determined by what that player chooses and what the other player chooses. So in the grid in front of you, you can see there are two players, Bill and Ann, and each one can choose to do one of two things. They can either cooperate or defect. So, so this is pretty intuitive, right? So they have the same sort of choices, and what one chooses determines, or one chooses what the other chooses determine which box they're in. And the box contains the payouts. So Ann is in the lower left-hand corner, that's her payout, and Bill is in the upper right-hand corner, that's his payout. And so, an easy way to figure this out is just look at which one is closest to each player. This isn't perfect, but it's sort of intuitive, right? So the row player always gets the lower left payout, and then the column player always gets the upper right. So looking at this case, we can see that Bill and Ann have two choices, to cooperate or defect. And so the story behind this individual game, the prisoner's dilemma game, and games are individuated based upon the sort of choices that someone can make and the payouts in the boxes. So if we change these payouts, it would change the type of game that it was. So the prisoner's dilemma is supposed to be a case of two prisoners, Bill and Ann, who are deciding whether to cooperate with the other prisoner or defect with the other prisoner. So in a sense, either to keep one's mouth shut, right, so that'd be cooperation. So say, these prisoners they committed some crime together, they're being investigated by the police, and to cooperate would be to keep your mouth shut, not say what happened, and to defect would be to rat the other person out to the police. And you get this characteristic payout structure whereby if you both cooperate, you get a pretty good outcome, a 3. So, and higher numbers are more desirable for that player, and don't read too much into the numbers. It really is, the more the better, right? So it needn't be that this is dollars or something. These numbers could be number of puppies saved or something like that. So you can have these, prisoner's dilemmas of saints, in a sense, right? Who have very noble ends, and so would rather have outcomes that we would think of as pro-social and moral. So don't worry about the payouts too much. Don't read too much into them. But what you can see is that if they both cooperate, they both get this pretty good outcome. If one cooperates and the other defects, then the one who cooperated gets their worst outcome, which makes sense, right? They'd go to prison because the other person ratted them out, and they didn't. And the other person gets their best outcome. You get a sweet deal, and you probably don't serve any time. And then you have these mirrors here, right, with defecting and cooperating of each player. The thing is, if both defect, they get this sort of intermediate, slightly bad outcome, which no one really wants. It's only barely better than the worst outcome, and it's worse than both of them cooperating, but it's still, it is better than the worst outcome. So the sort of interesting thing about the prisoner's dilemma is that when we look to see what is rational for them to do, they actually end up worse off. So let's think about what is actually rational for a player here to do. So let's look at what choice they should make given the payouts. So, and given any choice that the other player can make. So we want to compare choices and see which is the best one regardless of what the other player picks. If we do this, we see that, say Anne defected. Let's compare this to cooperate. If Anne defects and Bill cooperates, Anne ends up with 5, and Anne would end up with 3 if she cooperated. So in this case, it's better to defect. If Bill defects, right, so Anne ends up with 2, and if she had cooperated, she would end up with 1. So in this case, look, it's better in any case, no matter what Bill does, to defect. The problem is Bill will do the same sort of reasoning. And so Bill will also determine that it's better to defect. It's rational to defect. What happens? Well, the players end up in this box, which is kind of crappy, right? So 2, 2, which is, in higher numbers always better, so it's not that great. And the thing is, if you look at this cooperate box, so rationality will put both players in this box, but they could have gotten here if they had both just cooperated. So if they had resisted the urge to defect, they could have ended up with this better outcome. So this can explain, a few situations that city design might affect. So let's imagine there's a public street, and people have 2 options: either to put their trash in a trash can, so to walk the extra, 5 feet to put their trash in a trash can, or to throw it on the side of the road, right? And those correspond to cooperate and defect, respectively. So looking at the payouts, right, it'd be great. So let's imagine there's 2 people involved. It'd be great for Anne if Anne was able to litter and Bill didn't litter, right? Then there'd be, not very much litter, and Anne would still get to litter, which is great. And the same thing for Bill, right? So if they both littered, though, it gets kind of trashy, right? So the trash will build up. If they both litter, and they kind of get this same little crappy result. If they both refrained from littering, they'd have to go to the trash can, but they would end up with a really clean area, right? Which would be the cooperate. So, thinking about this example, and this is from Hardin, and it's called The Tragedy of the Commons, so you can look that up. It's derived from this prisoner's dilemma. It seems that people always defect, they'll always litter, because it's rational for them to do so. Okay, so there's a wrinkle in this, though. In one-shot prisoner's dilemmas, it's always rational to defect. But what people say is that we're never in one-shot prisoner's dilemmas, right? So if Anne knew that she would interact with Bill many, many times, right, she would probably try to get into this cooperate box, because, so with the one shot, you of course need to defect because you know the other person's going to defect, right? You know they're rational too, so we assume they're rational too, and they're going to do exactly what you're going to do. And so you'd be a fool not to defect yourself. But if you knew that you'd have a bunch of interactions with this person. And so you could eventually get far more, and pretty quickly get far more than you could defect from cooperate. Then you might move to cooperate. And, you know, if build defected, you'll move back to defect, but you have lots of interactions, so you'll be able to get, you know, your money back, so to speak. So this brings us to our next sort of topic. So this repeated prisoner's dilemma allows us to explain why cities are different than small towns. Because in small towns, as I was explaining earlier, it is likely that you're going to come across the same person again and again. So it's likely that you're going to have a very long series of interactions, and thus you can set up a very long series of cooperations and get, you know, a lot of money out of that. In cities, however, because you are unlikely to meet the same person again and again, it is still rational to defect. Because if you defect, there's really no repercussions, right? And you know the person is thinking in the same way, and thus it is rational to defect. You'd be a fool to cooperate. And so you might think that this is where we get, you know, certain city behaviors that are different from town behaviors. So, so before I talk about, you know, how this is related to urban design, you know, let me just return to the limits of, you know, to overload, right? So, how does urban design affect perceptual and cognitive and time overload? You know, here's the story. So certain features will limit or manage information. So, you know, if you have a smaller street or you know a lot of people, you don't have to constantly be aware of what's going on with people, right? So if you know most of the people on the street, you can concentrate on certain strangers that might be more of a threat than these people who you know, so you know things about them. And there's many other ways in which design sort of constrains the amount of information we have access to and then helps us process it, or sort of organizes it so that we can manage it better. So prisoner's dilemma, as I was saying a little earlier, you know, can work in sort of two ways. Here's to be more specific. You know, it can change the payouts, right? So if, you know, my example here is if, you know, we have like a lot of lighting on the street, and thus make crime, you know, so make defecting extremely risky, right? So we essentially decrease the payout for you know, for defecting when the other people are cooperating. Then it becomes not rational anymore to defect, right? To commit crimes and such. And so, you know, in this sort of way, you might think all we're doing is we're getting rid of the prisoner's dilemma. We're going in and saying, okay, how can we change the payouts? How can we change incentives to get people to do what we want them to do? And so that's one way of dealing with it. The other way is to, you know, talk about the repeated prisoner's dilemma and look at that and ask, okay, so what's the likelihood that I'll come in contact with this person again? And if we can increase that likelihood, if we can increase, you know, how much we you know about the person, or how likely we are to come in contact with them, then, you know, we can actually improve our chances of getting into the cooperate box. So, you know, what I've kind of mentioned here is that, you know, you can do this in two ways. You can actually interact with those people, you know, with the other player, or you can just learn things about them. So what happens when, you know, in a small town, when someone, you know, defects or does something against the other people? Well, no one's going to cooperate with them again. And so then it becomes irrational of an effect on the first, on the first move or on the first interaction, because you'll be stuck in this 2-2 spot when you get to the 3-3. So you can look at long-term payout. So from Jacobs, she talks about sidewalk talk, essentially. So people out talking in sidewalks, they share information. This could be a way to get, to increase information about the players involved. And so then urban design seems to be helping us with the game theoretic situation. And this might explain why this would, actually work. So that's all I wanted to say about environmental and character attributes. So, just keep in mind that what we're working with are two sort of poles of a mixed theory, right? One about stuff we learn. So what have we learned? What are the things we've learned? How are those going to affect us in the future? And the environment itself. And so the environment itself might affect us directly, right? And that's the environmental, the environment view. And so we want to mix those together because we want to say, of course, that culture and learning does matter, right? It does matter for our behavior, but the environment is very important. So we can't expect just to change an area completely, you might say unslum it, right, and expect everyone to act the way we expect, we want them to, right? So they've learned lots of things. They've had ways of adapting to their old situation, and they will bring those forward. So we need to be aware of that. But still, it seems like certain environments can improve things and can change things. Okay, so next time I'll look at economic and political pressures on cities and how that affects the view of the city that it's a growth machine. So this should be up tomorrow or Friday. I'm a little late, and I'm sorry about that. But this will sort of round out, the first two more informational, more descriptive information. The first 2 weeks. So next week we'll be talking about distributive justice, and that'll get more into some, some deeper ethics. And so keep doing the reading, and of course, make sure you start uploading your questions, in the discussion forum, 100 to 300 words. So make sure it's a well-thought sort of question or comment about what we've been reading, or lectures, or things like that. And so yeah, I'll see you on the forums. Bye.